The cold night air hung heavy over the streets of London, the lamps casting long, flickering shadows on the cobblestone roads near Buckingham Palace. Tourists milled about, some taking photos, others marveling at the stoic royal guard stationed outside the grand gates. The guards stood like statues, their ceremonial red tunics pristine, their bearskin hats towering above their heads, their gazes fixed straight ahead. Among the crowd, a man with a hooded sweatshirt and tattered jeans loitered near the railing, his posture tense, his fingers clenching and unclenching as if itching for trouble. His name was Jack Brick Coleman, a known troublemaker in the underground fight circles of London, a man whose reputation thrived on reckless bravado and unprovoked violence. His sharp, beady eyes flicked between the guards and the unsuspecting tourists, the corners of his mouth twitching into a smirk. He had spent the better part of the evening boasting to his equally rowdy friends that he could make a royal guard flinch. No, better yet, break his disciplined stance entirely. To Brick, these guards were nothing but glorified statues, men too weak to lift a finger even in the face of danger. And what better way to test that than with a baseball bat? His mates had laughed, slapped him on the back, daring him to prove it, knowing well that the city had laws against disturbing the Queen's Guard. But Brick had never cared for laws, nor for the authority they represented. He thrived on chaos, and tonight he sought a spectacle. The crowd buzzed around him, oblivious to his intentions, as he disappeared into a nearby alley, emerging moments later with a wooden bat slung over his shoulder. The weight of it felt familiar in his grip, the smooth wood worn from countless swings and back-alley fights. He sauntered forward, his steps slow but deliberate, cutting through the tourists like a prowling predator. His target stood tall just ahead, a lone royal guard at his post, his rifle resting stiffly against his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Brick's smirk widened. This was it. Without hesitation, he stepped past the invisible line that separated the public from the guarded perimeter, earning a few startled gasps from onlookers. Some pulled out their phones, sensing trouble but too entertained to intervene. Brick twirled the bat in his fingers, his eyes locked onto the stoic soldier, waiting for a reaction. Nothing. Not a flinch, not a twitch, not even the slightest acknowledgement. It was as if he were invisible. "What's the matter, mate?" Brick sneered, his voice loud enough to draw even more attention. "You deaf? Or just scared?" The guard did not move. His gaze remained locked ahead, his training and discipline unmatched. Brick clicked his tongue, feigning disappointment, and then in one sudden motion he swung the bat, fast, hard, a clean arc aimed directly at the guard's side. A collective gasp rang out as the crowd recoiled, but what happened next sent a shockwave through the air. Before the bat could make contact, the royal guard moved with a speed that defied his stiff posture. His arm shot out, intercepting the weapon mid-swing, his gloved hand gripping the wooden handle like a vice. The sheer force of the stop sent a shudder up Brick's arms, and his smirk faltered for the first time. For a brief second, there was a stillness, an eerie silence, before the guard twisted the bat effortlessly from Brick's grip and, in one fluid motion, turned the momentum against him. The crack of wood meeting flesh echoed through the square as the bat connected. Only this time, Brick was on the receiving end. His body lurched sideways, pain exploding through his ribs, sending him sprawling onto the cold pavement. A collective cheer and a chorus of gasps erupted from the crowd, phones now capturing every second of the fool's humiliation. But the guard wasn't done. Moving with the precision of a trained warrior, he stepped forward, pinning Brick down with a firm boot to his back, his expression unchanging, his grip on the bat unwavering. The man who had once laughed at the discipline of the royal guard now found himself completely at their mercy. The weight of his foolishness sank in as the night grew even colder. His pride shattered beneath the iron will of the Queen's finest. The onlookers watched in awe, and even Brick's so-called friends hesitated to intervene, their earlier laughter replaced with stunned silence. And then the guard spoke, his voice calm, steady and sharp as steel. "You chose the wrong battle, lad." The world around Brick spun in dizzying spirals, pain radiating from his ribs where the royal guard had struck him. He wheezed, trying to suck in air, but the force of the guard's boot pressing into his back kept him pinned. He felt the rough texture of the cobblestone scraping against his cheek, the coldness of the ground seeping into his bones. The once rowdy crowd had fallen into a stunned silence, their gasps now whispers, their laughter now murmurs of disbelief. He had been the predator, the instigator, the untouchable thug who played by no one's rules. But now, in the very heart of London, under the glow of flickering street lamps, he had been reduced to nothing more than a spectacle, a fool lying broken at the feet of a man who had barely moved. A surge of anger bubbled up in his chest, hot and fierce, battling against the humiliation that clawed at his pride. His fingers dug into the cracks of the pavement as he attempted to push himself up, but the boot on his back didn't relent. Instead, the weight bore down even more, as if reminding him of his place. The royal guard still hadn't changed his expression, hadn't broken his stance, hadn't even acknowledged the chaos around him. He was simply enforcing discipline, a force of order against the unruly, and that, more than anything, made Brick furious. With a growl, he twisted his body sharply, yanking his arm free and bucking against the weight pressing him down. The movement was abrupt, unexpected, and for a split second, the guard's boot lifted just enough for Brick to roll away. He scrambled to his knees, gasping, rage fueling his movements as he staggered back onto his feet. His bat, lay just a few feet away, discarded like an afterthought by the guard. Brick lunged for it, his fingers wrapping around the smooth wood, but the moment he turned back, his stomach clenched in dread. The guard was already advancing. Brick barely had time to react before the butt of the guard's rifle struck him square in the chest. The impact sent him reeling backward, his grip on the bat loosening as pain exploded across his ribs once more. He crashed onto his back, breath stolen from his lungs, vision swimming. The gasps from the crowd grew louder, their phones flashing, capturing every humiliating second of his downfall. His friends, the ones who had cheered him on, now stood frozen, eyes wide with shock. None of them dared to interfere. The royal guard, his stance still disciplined, took another step forward, his boots echoing sharply against the pavement. He wasn't breathing heavily, wasn't flustered, wasn't even fazed by the scuffle. It was as if this encounter meant nothing to him, just another insignificant disturbance in the grand scheme of things. And yet, to Brick, it was everything. It was a challenge, a battle, a humiliation he could not afford to accept. Snarling, Brick forced himself up once again, ignoring the screaming pain in his body. He spat onto the pavement, glaring up at the guard with bloodshot eyes. "You think you're tough, do you?" he hissed, his breath ragged. "You think you can just humiliate me in front of all these people?" The guard remained silent, Brick's fists clenched. He had always been a brawler, a man who thrived in street fights where rules didn't exist. This wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about proving he wasn't weak, that no man, uniformed or not, could lay him out and walk away without consequences. With a guttural roar, he lunged forward, swinging his fists wildly, and for the second time that night, he found himself on the wrong end of a perfectly executed counter. The guard sidestepped effortlessly, his movements precise, controlled. Before Brick could recover, a gloved fist connected with his jaw, sending his head snapping to the side. Stars burst across his vision, but the blows didn't stop. A sharp strike to his gut forced him to double over, and before he could react, the guard delivered a final, calculated strike to the back of his knee, sending him crashing to the ground once more. This time, he didn't get up. His limbs trembled, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he lay sprawled on the pavement. The pain was overwhelming, his body screaming in protest. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the exclamations of shock, the quiet laughter of those who had once cheered him on. Shame burned in his chest, hotter than any physical wound. And then the unmistakable sound of sirens pierced the air. Brick's stomach twisted into knots. Police. Blue lights bathed the scene in an eerie glow as officers pushed through the crowd, their hands resting on their belts, their expressions stern. Tourists parted, some still recording, others stepping back, unwilling to get caught in whatever was about to unfold. The lead officer, a tall, broad man with graying hair, approached with measured pace, his sharp eyes taking in the scene before landing on the royal guard. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. The guard didn't respond immediately. He glanced down at Brick, who was still struggling to push himself up, then back at the officer. When he finally spoke, his tone was as steady as his stance. "This man attempted to attack a member of the Queen's Guard," he said simply. The officer's gaze flicked to Brick, taking in his disheveled appearance, the bat lying a few feet away, the bruises already forming on his face. A sigh escaped his lips, as if he had already seen this kind of thing far too many times before. "Jack Coleman," the officer muttered, shaking his head. "Should have figured it'd be you." Brick groaned, spitting out the metallic taste of blood from his mouth. "Oh, shove it, Collins." The officer, Collins, sighed again, then motioned to the other officers behind him. "Get him up," he ordered. Hands grabbed Brick's arms, hauling him to his feet, despite his protests. Pain shot through his body as he grimaced, but he didn't fight back this time. He knew it was pointless. The reality of the situation had finally set in. He had picked a fight he couldn't win, humiliated himself in front of hundreds of people, and now he was about to face the consequences. The officer turned to the Royal Guard. "You good, soldier?" The guard gave a curt nod. "Unharmed." Collins exhaled, shaking his head. "Can't say the same for this idiot." He turned back to Brick, his expression unreadable. "You've really done it this time, Coleman. Disturbing the Queen's Guard? Assault with a deadly weapon? That's a whole new level of stupid, even for you." Brick said nothing. His head throbbed, his body ached, and the weight of his actions pressed down on him heavier than the guard's boot ever had. As the officers moved to escort him away, Collins threw one last glance at the guard. "Hell of a display," he muttered. "Didn't know you lot could fight like that." The Royal Guard simply returned to his post, his expression unreadable, his stance unwavering. It was as if the whole encounter had never happened, as if Brick had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a forgettable disruption in the grand order of things. Brick, however, would never forget. As he was dragged toward the waiting police car, the cheers of the crowd still ringing in his ears. He knew that tonight would be the night that would haunt him forever. And he knew, without a doubt, that he had made the worst mistake of his life. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Brick Coleman's wrists as he was shoved into the back of the police car, the door slamming shut with finality. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale laced with pain from his battered ribs and bruised jaw. The night had spiraled out of control faster than he could have imagined, and now the harsh glow of the flashing police lights only served as a cruel reminder of his downfall. Outside, the crowd continued to murmur, their phones still recording as the officers moved methodically, wrapping up what had become an impromptu public spectacle. Brick's head lolled back against the seat, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had never been afraid of jail. He had been inside before, spent nights in cold cells after bar fights, street brawls, and petty crimes. But this time it was different. This time, he wasn't just another street thug getting into trouble. He had attacked a Royal Guard, and that, he knew, was going to carry some serious weight. The driver's door opened, and Collins slid into the seat, adjusting his belt with an exhausted sigh. He glanced at Brick in the rear-view mirror, shaking his head as he started the engine. "You really outdid yourself this time, Coleman," he muttered. "You've pissed off the wrong people." Brick scowled but didn't respond. His jaw ached too much to argue, and honestly, what could he say? That he hadn't meant to? That he thought he'd get away with it? The truth was, he had never considered the consequences. He had spent his whole life skating by, always on the edge, always pushing the limits. And for the first time, he had pushed too far. The car rolled through the quiet streets, the city lights casting flickering patterns through the window. Brick shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing. He thought of his so-called friends, the ones who had egged him on, who had laughed when he boasted about humiliating the Queen's Guard. Where were they now? Nowhere. Not a single one of them had stepped in when things went south. He had been alone the moment he hit the pavement. The police station was only a short drive away, and when they arrived, Collins didn't waste time. The door swung open, and two officers yanked Brick out, guiding him inside with firm grips. The bright fluorescent lights of the booking area made his head pound even more. The room smelled of stale coffee, sweat, and a faint chemical tang of disinfectant. A bored-looking officer sat behind the desk, barely glancing up as Collins approached. "Name?" Collins exhaled heavily. "Jack Coleman." That got the officer's attention. He raised an eyebrow, finally looking up at Brick with mild interest. "The one who swung a bat at a Queen's Guard." Collins nodded. "That's the one." A slow whistle escaped the officer's lips. "Damn." That's got to be a new level of stupid. Brick clenched his jaw. He was sick of hearing that. Sick of the comments, the judgment. But what could he say? They weren't wrong. Collins nudged him forward. Get him processed. He'll be in holding for now, but considering the charges, I doubt he'll be walking free anytime soon. Brick felt his stomach sink. He had been arrested before, sure, but this wasn't like the usual slap-on-the-wrist nonsense he was used to. Assaulting a member of the Royal Guard was serious business. The next hour was a blur of fingerprints, paperwork, and a mugshot he knew would haunt him. Eventually, he was led down a dimly lit corridor, the air thick with the stale stench of confinement. The cells were lined up in neat rows, the iron bars casting long shadows against the flickering overhead lights. A few other detainees milled about, some slumped against the walls, others pacing restlessly. His cell door clanged open. "In you go," the officer muttered, shoving him inside before locking the door behind him. Brick collapsed onto the bench, exhaling sharply. His body ached, his head throbbed, and exhaustion pulled at his limbs. He leaned back against the cold cement wall, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing with everything that had led him here. Hours passed. The noises of the station faded into the background, a distant murmur of voices, the occasional clang of cell doors, the rhythmic tapping of boots against the floor. And then the silence broke. A voice, steady, low, unmistakable. Well, if it isn't the bat-swinging fool. Brick's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Slowly, he turned his head, his pulse spiking. Standing just outside the bars, his posture as rigid as ever, was the Royal Guard, not in his ceremonial uniform, not with his towering hat. But even in plain clothes, his presence was unmistakable. The same sharp eyes, the same unwavering stance, the same damn air of discipline that had shattered Brick's arrogance earlier that night. Brick swallowed hard, his throat dry. "You." The guard tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Disappointed? Brick's fist clenched. He wasn't sure what he felt. Anger? Embarrassment? Fear? The guard stepped closer, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Brick forced a smirk, though it felt weak even to him. "What made history? Bet no one's ever done what I did." The guard didn't laugh. His gaze remained steady, piercing through Brick like a blade. "No," he said calmly. "You made a fool of yourself. You embarrassed yourself in front of hundreds of people. And now, you'll pay the price for it." Brick's jaw tightened. "Yeah, well, you guard don't scare me." The guard took another step forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Oh, but we should, because you didn't just attack me. You attacked everything we stand for. And people like you, Coleman?" He leaned in slightly. "You never win." Brick wanted to lash out, wanted to fire back with something sharp, something cocky. But the words caught in his throat, because deep down, he knew the guard was right. The guard studied him for a moment longer before stepping back. "Enjoy your stay," he said, turning on his heel. Brick watched him go, his heart hammering. For the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar, not anger, not defiance, but regret. The cell door remained locked, the night stretching long before him. And for the first time, Brick wondered if this was a moment his life had truly changed.